Dissensus in business ethics. In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at an argument about radical democracy in relation to business ethics, looking at the essay Dissensus, Radical Democracy and Business Ethics by Carl Rhodes, Ian Munro, Torkild Tannen, and Alison Pullen, as well as Envisioning a Democratic Culture of Difference, Feminist Ethics and the Politics of Dissent in Social Movements by Sheena Vachani. So to understand the goal of dissensus in business, we first have to acknowledge that corporations ultimately will flout, notions of justice or freedom or whatever other values a supposed democratic liberal society might have, because it's always going to be profit that will be pursued, right? So instituting woke training or doing philanthropy, right? These are typically done because it doesn't affect the bottom line or it actually increases profit. That's really, of course, what businesses care about. And this is at odds with the fact that liberal democracy promises opportunity and inclusion. And it does this because liberal democracy advocates capitalism and is married to capitalism. And yet, democratic states are complicit in the strengthening power and the corporations that they glorify as wealth creators and job securers, where corporations are touted as providing opportunity to people, and therefore they have this kind of privileged position in liberal democratic society. And this is at odds with, again, the fact that they constantly flout notions of justice, equality, and freedom. With radical democracy, the task is to fight against the powers, injustices, and inequalities that affect people politically and materially. So the goal is to go from the outside to attack corporate power, to make businesses more ethical, not by relying on businesses to do so, but by anti-hegemonic means. So political dissensus is required for radical democracy because it bears witness to the marginalized voices that are excluded from prevailing status quo, and it seeks to enact a particular ethics rested in the radical questioning and subversion of the totalizing tendencies of power. That political dissensus seeks to break up the hegemony which a business has over ethical reforms, and instead seeks to embrace the ability for non-shareholders, right, to affect and to act based on solidarity for the sake of workers or other stakeholders, right, that might be affected by the actions of corporations. And it's meant to get us to question, right, fundamental assumptions we have about businesses. Now, this requires a kind of reorientation in ethics. So dissensus draws us to look at, contest, and respond to the interlocking patterns of domination that are based on racial, gender, and class inequality. It wants us to look at, right, these different things that typically in liberal democracy, these can often be equalized, right, to kind of have the same quantifiable value, such that if you all are citizens with one vote, then all of your interests are going to be represented equally. But this isn't exactly true, because the experiences of different, races or genders or classes, right, affect then policies unequally. So businesses need to take seriously the lives of and voices of those who have been excluded from the neoliberal consensus, the consensus that seeks to give more power back to businesses. So the authors write, doing so means decentering business from business ethics, for example, by engaging with the social movements and political activists that struggle through and for radical democracy. This includes paying attention to social movements that fight for indigenous rights, including land rights and water policy, refugee and immigrants' rights, and whistleblowers who, at the risk of dismissal, silencing, and persecution, speak out against pollution, tax evasion and corruption, sexual violence, illegal surveillance, war crimes, and torture. So business ethics is traditionally grounded in moral frameworks that are meant for reflective discussion, that we think about what might this ethics tell us about how we ought to operate, right? And this is done by people who hold power. Now, in contrast, social movements tend to be grounded in political action for change rather than reflection, that they're often aimed at directly subverting and challenging dominant social norms that oppress marginalized groups rather than merely reflecting on them. So there's a much more militant action that is taken by social movements. Now, consensus politics around a kind of hegemonic liberal democracy or politics which seeks consensus in business, the authors argue that this tends to become a process of policing, exclusion, and silencing, where, of course, you have to maintain a consensus which has been achieved. Right? This ends up focusing on maintaining existing hegemonic relations, where if this is, whatever concern is outside the consensus, then it is illegitimate. It cannot be entertained. In contrast to this, dissensus concerns radical social transformation, the formation of a counter-hegemony, and the disruption of the policing of who can be seen and heard, that the floor is open to all. They write, this dissensus concerns inventing new ways of making sense of the sensible, new configurations between the visible and the invisible, and between the audible and the inaudible, that which is there but which is not seen. Why is it not seen? Because the formal mechanisms that would make it be seen, that it could be heard in matters of political deliberation, counted as illegitimate, right? That a certain situation is given, and therefore it's the acceptable thing of which we can reflect on, and other concerns are not acceptable. Well, dissensus wants to say no, right? Each place, each experience, each concern has a place at the table. Now, we can get a more concrete example of this, right, in looking at a feminist approach to the politics of difference and dissensus in business ethics. So how difference is constructed in business ethics and corporate social responsibility literature is intimately related to the positions of power, and that needs to be understood in relation to the political and social context in which organizations function. So, thus, what becomes important are the lived social dimensions of sexual difference, not as biological differences between bodies, but as the ontological status of the sexed body. Right? What that means is you might have a certain policy in a business, right, that is supposed to treat everyone as equal. And yet, the experiences of some people, because of the way in which their status is of their, body, their embodied experience, we could say, in a social context, their experience is different for, a business situation, such that having a policy which is supposed to treat everybody as equal actually does injustice to those with a different kind of ontological status or a different sexual difference. So an ethics of sexual differences creates new conditions for the articulation of difference in the context of business ethics rather than reinscribing essentialist presumptions. Instead, this means ethics should be seen as a contested terrain. So an ethics of dissensus is less about how we account for the plurality and conflicts of irreducible differences, such as class, race, and gender, which form a more suitable basis for understanding radical democracy and the antagonisms and dissent that it depends on. So let's get an even more concrete example of what this looks like. Two cases, the Me Too movement and Sisters Uncut. So the Me Too movement, of course, was a movement whereby women were able to say, hey, look, this is, this experience of sexual harassment or sexual violence that has been going on, and it has been ignored because certain experiences of women haven't been taken as legitimate. So Me Too has raised a series of issues around women's agency, difference, and how one kind of justice can overshadow other injustices. And what this does is it seeks to say, look, there has been these patterns of practices that have been exploiting women, which men did not realize because their sexual embodiment did not make them attuned to pick up on this. But now we can look at this. We can say, look what women have been saying about this experience. And we take that to the table and treat that as, an equally legitimate concern. Now, there is one potential issue with the Me Too movement, though, with political dissensus in business. So, one problem is the focus on individualism, especially the heroism of the individual's resilience, which can prevent mobilizing people politically and collectively, because the goal is to build solidarity. And if too much of the discourse gets wrapped up around the individual, then you need to build solidarity among people who are not, for example, just people who have experienced sexual harassment or sexual violence, and those who are of a different sexual orientation, or sexually embodied differently, that don't experience that. That you need to be able to have a more universal claim to justice, but which proceeds through a politics of difference. Now, the other example is Sisters Uncut. So this group uses direct action as a way of revealing structural problems, alternatives, and solutions to tackling social problems. And it does so through direct action, like occupying spaces, hanging banners to draw attention to social issues, blocking bridges, and calling out sexual harassment, whatever forms it takes, because its purpose is to be disruptive. That through disruption, right, that it makes us stop for a moment, right? If you're trying to get somewhere and the road is blocked because there's a protest, it causes you to stop and think for a moment, what is this protest about, right? It makes you, for a second, almost step back and think, what have I been doing in my life that I, didn't take, or that I took for granted, right? That I wasn't aware of, that I didn't take into account. So the tactical reassertion of dissensus and a politics of difference politicizes sexual difference for the sake of equality. And it does so to develop capacities for solidarity and democratic engagement, not based on shared experiences of oppression that collapses or elides other forms of lived experience, but on shared goals, right? That we take into account different experiences of oppression for the sake of a shared goal of justice. So feminist politics of differences offers ways of disturbing business organizations for the sake of justice through critique and resistance to the sovereignty of business, that we do not rely on business to act on behalf of justice, because, of course, the bottom line of business is profit. So instead, a democratic culture of difference, understood through sexual difference, thus offers a conceptual framework through which to reimagine the constitutive exclusions faced by marginalized or vulnerable groups, where our desire to install a new kind of social system does not preclude us from living in the one that exists.